7. Goober peas.
A catchy marching song glorifying the lowly Georgia people. It was a subject whimsical enough to take the soldier's mind off his troubles for a while.
Limbo, you remember Brady? You remember the Civil War? You remember the Civil War? Colors again if you need them. We shall be continuing.
Oh my God, bro. You gonna do the color again?
Ready, day 2.
You think the camera is continuing?
Ready, day 2.
Will we record? You're recording? Oh, I forgot he was recording. Hey, to all y'all little kids out there, if you failing this class, bro, it's a shame, my boy.
Let's go. We know where we're going today. One with reading glasses, notes from yesterday. We shall be continuing. Ain't that right? Okay. What word for? Well, isn't that what kind of sign? Everyone grabs your time.
How are you?
So bad.
Life is good.
Thank you, bro. Oh yeah. It's not our birthday today. I promise you it's not.
I'm sure the Albert. Layla.
I promise you it's not our birthday. My birthday always this Sunday. Y'all know this. Don't worry. Wait.
Day 2. Got your glasses. Get your pencils if you need them. Get your notes. We shall continue what we were doing yesterday. Here's what I do. Hi-yo. Again? Day 2. I think what you meant to say is, oh, but you skipped me. Well, what about you?
So good about not
She does not like it. Angel. He's video. You just stay.
All right, come on, take a seat. Hey, take a seat.
There you go. Don't read it.
Angel.
I think we are ready to get started. So the duos who regularly talk to each other, on chance, I'll break you up. Hopefully nobody will get interrupted and checked out. All of that.
That female here today?
Nah, it's not.
She was our substitute yesterday.
Oh, she. Let me stay here.
What did you call her?
All right.
I ain't know her name, so I said
Notes. You got your notes.
Say Ashley or Ashley?
Miss Ashley.
Ashley.
We have your notes. So there are, a dozen or more 3D pictures to go. And of course, we have the non-3D pictures along the way as well. Sharpening pencils before I get started is a good way to do it.
Ooh, my hair.
Yeah, playing that song in my head, bro.
I did hear it's Big Guy's birthday, so
It's not.
what?
It's not. It's
two.
not. It's
Oh,
not.
one.
It's not. It's not. It's not. It's not. It's not.
It's not till
Guess what?
December.
My birthday
You need 19.
one day, and I
Got.
Yeah,
That's it. They got me. I got.
we ain't got no school.
I told you it was my birthday.
Hey, at least you got caught up.
Also, it's our birthday.
Oh, bro,
I just turned
I can't
60.
trust anyone anymore since I almost sold out on Mark One's non-birthday.
I just turned 16.
Very on birthday. I am birthday for you.
Y'all,
Very on birthday for you. And you. Okay. We left off right here. The Battle of, how do you say it? Manitoga.
And it's
I'm glad I asked you to try.
Antietam.
Antietam, right? Now, you may remember the North had one way of naming battles and the South had a different way of naming battles. What did the North use to name their battles?
Bull Run.
Was it like cities, close cities by?
I'll say
South.
Waterways was the Northern naming convention, and Ansley, the South,
Cities that were
the
close by.
city or town nearby. Now, I looked at our Georgia standards because I wanted to make sure I was saying the right thing. It will use the Northern naming. Okay, so I'm kind of just educating you. When I say both names, I'm educating you, but I will make sure you know the Northern name because that's actually what's going to be used for the exam. But we're not all about just the exam. We're about knowing history, so that's why I tell you both of them. Antietam, aka Sharpsburg, so they happened at Sharpsburg, Maryland. And you remember there's kind of some James Bond stuff going on because the Northerners, the Northern Army, intercepted the Southern battle plans. How? What were they in?
Oh, the cigar
Cigar
thingy.
Yeah, that's right. The Southern battle plans was wrapped up into cigars. And when a messenger who was carrying these battle plans was stopped, his stuff was searched. All of a sudden, the Union had Robert E. Lee's master battle plans. And because of that, they were able to turn the victory. So victory for the Union. This is especially disappointing to Robert E. Lee because in addition to wanting to win the battle, of course you want to win the battle, well, he was also trying to inspire a foreign ally to come and join the Southern cause. France and England was trade partners with the Southern states, right? Tobacco, cotton, and all the other cash crops. So it would kind of be reasonable for them to join the Southern cause and help out their trade partner. But much like the American Revolution, the Southerners were the rebels. They were the upstart army. They kind of had to prove that they were an army to actually be reckoned with. They had to prove that they were capable of winning a big battle. Robert E. Lee really hoped that Antietam would be that battle. It would be the battle to convince France or England to join their cause. Of course, the opposite happens. He loses the battle, and with that, he really loses the opportunity to gain that type of a war partner or an ally. So big significance from Antietam. On the Union side, Abraham Lincoln uses Antietam. Oh, and I'll say that what you drew in your circle was a big old blood spatter because why?
It was the bloodiest day. Wait,
It was the bloodiest war.
single day in American.
Single bloodiest day in American history, September 17th, 1865. You got a fact?
Which comes with a way to think of that in
Okay.
terms of A being the first letter of the alphabet, one day battle, bloodiest Daily Assembly Day.
Yeah, it
And
is
that
a
way, if you can't pronounce it, you see the A,
There you
and you can make that
A
association.
first letter of the alphabet. It is a one-day battle. It is also the single bloodiest battle of the war and of American history. I gave you some other numbers. Pearl Harbor, 2,400 people dead. 9/11, 2,900 people dead. Not the bloodiest days in American history. Antietam was the single bloodiest, it still to this day is the single bloodiest day in American history. So a major battle, total bloodletting. Obviously the tragedy of war is that they were all Americans, right? We weren't even fighting a foreign army, we were fighting each other. So everybody who died that day was an American in some way or another. Now Lincoln uses the Battle of Antietam and the victory of Antietam for momentum. He sees that the Union is winning the war, and he decides it's time to issue his Emancipation Proclamation. Now, you've probably heard of this before in your 4th grade, 5th grade studying of the Civil War. I'm going to go a little bit deeper right now with the Emancipation Proclamation. What the Emancipation Proclamation says is this: all slaves in rebelling states are free. All states in southern rebelling states are free. Did that free all slaves?
No.
No. Who did it not free? What about those states that stayed in the Union but still allowed slavery? Everybody do it with me now. The border states. I will. So look at the map here. The blue states are the Union states that do not have slavery. The red states are states that seceded and do have slavery. But those middle states with the striped red, they stayed in the Union. Okay, they fought for the North, but they continued to allow slavery. Abraham Lincoln does not want to make them angry. Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, West Virginia. He does not want to make them angry by freeing their slaves. They might join the southern side if that was the case. So he frees what's that? They're called border states, yeah. He frees the slaves in the rebelling states, those that have actually seceded. But now here's the other quirk. The Northern Army didn't really have control of the Deep South. Do you think that Deep South, heart of Alabama, was going to let their slaves go free just because Abraham Lincoln said so?
No.
They don't even like the guy. They don't think he's their president. They broke away so that he's not their president. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was largely sentimental. It was a good statement. It showed that the war was fighting on behalf of enslaved Africans, but it was largely sentimental. It actually didn't have a lot of impact overall because it couldn't really free the slaves. Alabama, Georgia, Florida, they're not going to free their slaves just because Abraham Lincoln said so. They don't even like Abraham Lincoln. Now, when the Union Army went into these states and maybe captured some ground, maybe they would go onto the plantations and free those slaves. They would. But the Union Army wasn't in control of the Deep South at this point. So what I'm saying is, I'm repeating it over and over and over so that you get it. The Emancipation Proclamation was largely sentimental. Now, there was a side effect. The hope was, as the word spread, maybe these enslaved Africans, these slaves, they will hear that Lincoln has freed the slaves with emancipation, the Emancipation Proclamation. And because they've heard of this, they'll be inspired to run away to the north. If they run away to the north, they know that they'll have their freedom as long as they reach a northern state. And what that's really doing is taking slave labor away from the south. The hope was that thousands of slaves would run to the north, leaving their plantation. Of course, they're leaving the labor force, and they're no longer being, they're not in the south, and they're not working for the south as slaves. So that was a hope that the Northerners had coming off the Emancipation Proclamation as well. Maybe it'll inspire slaves to run away. They get north, they're free, and that hurts the South because they lose their laborers. One more major side product, and it's the last bullet point there. I just talked about how the South was hoping that France or Britain would join their cause. It would be one thing for France or England to join them as a trade partner. Hey, that's our partner. We get cotton and tobacco from them. They're fighting a war against a tyrant in their country. We're going to go support them. That would be one thing for them to support their trade partner. It'd be a totally different thing for them to support the breakaway country that was in favor of slavery. What the Emancipation Proclamation does is it gives the Union a moral purpose for fighting. Now, I know a lot of times we think Civil War was to end slavery. Actually, at the start, the Civil War was not exclusively focused on ending slavery. It was about states' rights. It was about the sectionalism that existed in the country. The North had a way of life. The South had a way of life. It wasn't only about ending slavery. But Abraham Lincoln's proclamation makes it about slavery. He, as a person, was always one who wanted to free the enslaved Africans. But he knew he couldn't just say that right away. He knew he couldn't just come out with it. He had to have momentum in the war, had to be winning the war in order to turn the tide, change people's opinions. And he uses the victory at Antietam to make this statement that now we're fighting on behalf of enslaved Africans. We are freeing them, and that's what the rest of this war is about. Do you think that every Northerner agreed with this statement?
No.
That's true. Not every Northerner agreed with this statement. There are a lot of people who were pro-union. Like, we should stay together. The states that broke away, they are rebels. They should not have broken away. So the people are pro-union, but they're also pro-slavery. A lot of Northerners were still in favor of slavery. That doesn't make them a Southerner, but they were in favor of slavery. Actually, I'll click back a couple. Lincoln's top commander, I should have queued this up differently.
Wait, that don't make no sense.
Lincoln's top commander here, McClellan, he was pro-slavery. He was pro-union, which is why he's a Union Army officer, but he is pro-slavery. So remember, they're having a kind of a hard conversation here. Lincoln is saying, hey man, I need you to be more aggressive. Lincoln eventually fires him. Yeah, they took that picture by standing really still. That's how they took that picture. Isn't that photography amazing? Right? Don't you feel like you're there? Pictures like that makes me feel like I'm there. Yeah. So I'll make it even crazier for you. All right. This is a little extra. This is not on your notes. This is just a little extra. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln runs for re-election. He has an opponent. You know who his opponent is?
That guy.
That's right. Yeah. General McClellan. It's Lincoln versus McClellan in the election of 1864. McClellan runs as a pro-slavery unionist. Lincoln, of course, is against slavery and wants to keep the Union together as well. Now, Lincoln beats him pretty soundly. Lincoln wins 55% of the vote, 90% of the electoral vote, so Lincoln definitely wins. Basically beats him twice because he fired him and then he beat him for president. So all that to say, the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't the end-all, be-all of freeing the slaves. There was still more work to be done. And I'm trying to get back to where I was. But the takeaway here is Antietam is associated with the Emancipation Proclamation. We win at Antietam. We, the Union, wins at Antietam. And because of that, Lincoln uses the momentum to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This is still the country as it's set up. Blue to the north, red to the south. The border states, they stayed in the Union, but they allowed slavery. Devin, what's your question?
Wait, I thought the whole point was living in the north was you didn't like slavery.
So Devin said, that's kind of a common thought. All northern states were against slavery. That's actually not the case. There's these border states that were still having slavery. They just stayed in the Union. So a couple of pictures here about African Americans. I'm gonna talk about I'm going to talk about the role of African Americans in the Civil War here for just a second. Isn't it crazy that when it all boils down to it, the Civil War turned on this right here? It was really about agrarian labor and cotton. Now, I picked this out of a family field in November time frame, and my wife said, what are you going to do with that? Take it to your class? I was like, yeah, I'm going to show the kids what cotton looks like. She goes, they're from Alma. They know what cotton looks like. But anyhow, this is cotton right off the, right out of the ground. And this is why slave labor was so necessary. This right here is why the Southern economy needed slave labor. So this is what the Civil War turned on. Ansley, the cotton gin actually was invented at this time, but that actually perpetuated the need for slave labor. Even though it got a little less labor intensive, the cotton gin, which you just turned with a hand crank, it kind of still made the need for a cotton even higher. I'm glad you know. What else I got here? Okay, so African American soldiers. This is not on your notes. This is extra. So just hear me on it. This is the history of your country. Terry, why don't you come on up here? All right, you touching him on the shoulder. Why don't you come on up here? Do better for everybody. Promise. African American soldiers. So after the Emancipation Proclamation, a lot of African Americans found themselves able to sign up and join the army. Right? If the Union is going to fight for their freedom and the freedom of their people, they wanted to be a part of it. Sad little extra here is that there was still segregation, right? We say we're a country for all men created equal, but still there's the white army and then there's the black segregated units. So unfortunately, our country was still slow to come. And we're going to talk about segregation for a long time. We're still going to have a lot of learning left to do on that. We're going to walk ourselves right into Martin Luther King Jr.'s portion of history. This unit right here, though, one of the most famous black units, all African American units, was called the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. They, every Army unit has a number and a name to it. They were known as the 54th Massachusetts. They had a lot of equality inside of their units because they had all ranks. They weren't just the low soldiers. They also had sergeants. They were the non-commissioned officers. Now, their officers were white gentlemen, but generally abolitionists who were in favor of the black man's cause. So their officers were taken in with equality and rights, and they wanted to treat them well. Did I see a hand? Do I have a question?
Oh, no, I was.
Okay. One other picture here. This is just kind of showing African Americans in the war. This is a sketch from a Confederate prisoner of war. And in Maryland, there's a very large prisoner of war camp. Yeah. In Maryland, there's a very large prisoner of war camp. And the Confederates were the prisoners, and guess who their guards were? Black people. Black soldiers were their guards. So what this guy is saying here is he basically says the bottom is on the top now. The tables have turned. That's what the cartoon says. This is a real sketch from a soldier, a white guy, who's being guarded by a black guy, and he's saying the tables have turned. The bottom is on the top now. I think it's a fascinating sketch from history to show that these Southerners who have been oppressing black people for generations, they are now finding themselves imprisoned, and their guards are African Americans. So that's a pretty cool little extra there. Here's a picture of the 54th Massachusetts. You can see, what are they wearing? Army uniforms. Yeah, what are they carrying? Army weapons, right? So I don't know if it was I don't know if they got the best weapons or maybe they got leftovers, but they were outfitted. They were outfitted like an Army unit. They were treated like an Army unit. I told you that their officers were white, but they were generally sympathetic to the African Americans' cause. And this unit, they didn't do just grunge work. They didn't do just the dirty work in the Army. They actually fought on the front lines, and they have a couple of significant battles that they were a part of. One of the battles, it's kind of smaller in the whole grand scheme of the Civil War, but it's called the Battle of Fort Wagner. This is a portrait, okay? We are at the point where we have photography, but not a lot of action photography, because you had to wait, a long time for the film to expose, so that would make it blurry. So we're still looking at some art, but we are getting a whole lot closer to having good photography as well. What you can see here, this is at the Battle of Fort Wagner, which is in Charleston, South Carolina, if I remember correctly. Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. What you see here at the middle of the pit, what do you see right in the middle of the picture? Kind of the focal point.
The flag, yeah.
The flag, and then who's with the flag?
The general.
Yeah, the one white guy that you see in the picture. Actually, there's two. There's another one off to the right-hand side. But check this out. This is their regimental commander. His name is Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, Colonel Shaw. And what's notable about him is that he didn't lead from behind. He didn't say, hey, you guys go fight, and I'll just be watching.
He was up there with him.
He was up there with him. That's right, leading the charge. And the 54th Massachusetts led the charge on Fort Wagner. And it was actually a Union loss. Unfortunately, it was a loss that they were part of in this big battle. But they were kind of the leading edge of the Union fight. They're the guys that got thrown against the fortification. Like, hey, go breach that wall. Go break into that fort for us. So they serve very honorably. They are known for their ferociousness on the battlefield at Fort Wagner. This is a monument to the 54th Massachusetts. This is in Boston because that's where they were called up from. right? Hey, Massachusetts people. Hey, Bostonians. We're trying to raise a regiment of all colored people. Come to Boston and sign up to join the Army. So this is them marching off to war from Boston, Massachusetts. And so you can see this in Boston. Now, I want to go back to their colonel real quick. This is a picture of him, Colonel Shaw. And the picture, right, you remember that painting where he's got the sword and he's leading from the front? There's a little bit of a story about Colonel Shaw. He died on the battlefield. He died right alongside many African-American soldiers. And since they lost the battle, since the Union lost the battle, unfortunately, they didn't have a chance to recover the bodies. So what that means is that the Confederate Army, the Southerners, the slave owners, they gathered up the bodies. And how do you think they treated the bodies?
They burned.
Yeah, not respectfully. They put them in a mass grave. They did not burn them, but they were put into a mass grave. And it was just kind of a shameful burial for soldiers. Usually both sides treated the dead pretty honorably, especially if there were officer dead involved. But in this case, a bunch of Confederates, a bunch of slave owners, and of course there's African American soldiers involved in this battle. They took the bodies, they just put them in a mass grave. And then, kind of an insult upon the injury, they took Colonel Shaw's body, even though he's a white guy, even though he was an officer. A lot of times the officers were treated with, big respect. They took his body and they put him in with the African Americans. The Confederates saw this as an insult. But I want you to read this statement from Colonel Shaw's father. After the war was over, there was an opportunity to go dig these bodies up and maybe take them back to their families. But Colonel Shaw's father says this: "We can imagine no holier place than that in which he lies, among the brave and devoted followers, nor wish for him better company." He's saying, leave him where he is. He's with the people that he loves. He's with the people that loved him. He loved these men. They were soldiers. It didn't matter what color their skin were. They were his soldiers. And if he's resting with them, then that's where he needs to stay. So that's a pretty beautiful sentiment. Amen is right. That's a pretty beautiful sentiment. Comes from the story of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And this story is also made into a movie called Glory. And you got some real A-listers there. Matthew Broderick, Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman. All right? You got some real A-listers in this movie. It's a bit of an older movie. I think it came out in 1989. So you weren't alive. I was barely alive.
You know your dad?
But a really good movie. I'm sure it's on all those services like Amazon Prime or Hulu and Vudu, all your movie services. If you're curious, this is my recommendation. It's a very good movie for you to watch. We might find time to watch a little bit of it in class later, a little bit towards the end of the semester. But we can't stop and watch every single movie that I want to. We never go anywhere. Moving right along to the Gettysburg. Have you heard of Gettysburg before? Like in your Civil War learning, even at the small level, right? 4th grade, 5th grade, whatever you've learned about so far. Gettysburg is a big battle, right? Gettysburg is a really important battle. So I'm going to briefly tell you all about Gettysburg as you take your notes here, okay? Gettysburg is known as the turning point of the war, and we'll sketch that in just a second. Gettysburg was fought in the summer of 1863. General Lee invades north. He invades into Pennsylvania in the summer of 1863. His big goal, his ultimate goal, was to capture Washington, D.C. The Confederates thought if we can capture the capital city, Washington, D.C., we can hold it hostage. We can basically force them to negotiate with us to win the war, right? So they wanted to capture Washington, D.C. Well, along the way there, he goes into Pennsylvania. And, the town of Gettysburg is not much to write home about. You probably wouldn't go there on purpose, except for these days. It's a very historic site, of course. But it's not a metropolis. It's not New York City. It doesn't have a lot going on for it. It's just sleepy Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. What it did have in it was a shoe factory. So Robert E. Lee catches word that this northern town has a shoe factory in it. And he starts to march towards Gettysburg because of the shoe factory. Why would he want to go to this town with a shoe factory?
Equipment for his men.
Straight up, right on it, Marquand, because his guys are struggling on equipment, especially on their footwear. So he says, I'm going to go capture all the materials and all the shoes inside of this factory, and my guys are going to get some shoes. So the Confederates are coming up on Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Well, you got to think about the lack of technology in this day. They didn't have drones. They didn't have satellites. They didn't have GPS, imagery, all that kind of stuff. The Northerners, they are also coming up on Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The Southerners don't know it. The Northerners don't know it. The way they find out about each other is sending out cavalry patrols, horse patrols. Well, as it comes to be, on July 1st, these cavalry patrols make contact with each other. Oh, the Southern Army is just down that way. The Northern Army is just down that way. We are about to have ourselves a big battle in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and it all started because of the shoe factory. So it's a 3-day battle, July 1st, July 2nd, July 3rd. There are a lot of famous pieces of the Battle of Gettysburg. I'm not going to be able to tell you about all the military history of it. There's famous things like Pickett's Charge, Devil's Den, Little Round Top. Each of these represents kind of a part of the battle that's found famousness in American history. But we can't really get into all the moving pieces. Suffice it to say, it was a very large battle. Over 170,000 people participated. So think about that. Think about the years on down the line. Those people have kids. Those kids give them grandkids. So you got a whole generation where people who were impacted by Gettysburg. My dad was at Gettysburg. My grandpa was at Gettysburg, and he told me this story. You got Northerners who are telling their version of the story. You got Southerners who are telling their version of the story. Gettysburg becomes a big part of our national history, and actually a pretty big wound, because so many people were hurt or killed there. Gettysburg becomes really synonymous with one of our big national wounds. 170,000 people participate, 10,000 people dead, 30,000 more people wounded. So about 40,000 total casualties. In the Southern Army, Lee loses 1/3 of his soldiers, 1/3 of his army. Remember, he's got the smaller army to start with. He's got the fewer amount of soldiers to begin with, in a smaller population to even get soldiers from. So losing 1/3 of his army, whoa, pretty significant. At this time, on July 3rd, when the North emerges victorious, it is basically a belief that the end is in sight. Now, there's still some more war to go, but it's almost like the end is in sight. The Southern Army, they reached their peak. They walked into Gettysburg. It's actually called the high watermark of the Confederacy, the highest point of success they've been having so far. But after Gettysburg, they're on the downward slope. The Northern Army, having defeated the Confederates in such a big way, they're on the up and up. So it's almost like it's the beginning of the end for the Confederates, and it's almost the beginning of the final victory for the Union. The end is in sight. Now, there is about another year of the war, and there's more fighting and more dying to be done. But the end is near. This is a major turning point of the battle. And I think, a couple more pictures here. So this is some battlefield photography. A lot of Civil War photography focused on dead people. That's because, like I said, not a lot of action photographs from this time period. Cameras aren't that good just yet. But a lot of photographers would pose the bodies in dramatic ways. They would put a weapon with the body to make it look like he had died while fighting. Maybe they moved his arms or his legs in a way that made it more dramatic. There's a very famous Civil War photographer named Matthew Brady, and he kind of pioneered a lot of journalism and a lot of photography during this time frame. So I'm pretty sure this is a Matthew Brady photograph. A couple of 3D ones here. Got those interspersed. Third block like this one, I think it pops out the screen pretty well. I like the tents there. It just shows that the Army didn't move very fast. Everywhere they went, they pitched their tent. They pulled out their chairs, pulled out their tables. And never miss a chance to play cards, even while you're waiting for the battle to break out. A group of soldiers here. Oh, actually, this is the Army band. A little bit of a side history for you. They weren't playing music just for fun. They were actually a really important part of signaling on the battlefield. Bugle calls and drum patterns were a very important part of communication on the battlefield, right? We didn't have radios. We didn't have phones. And a drum and a bugle could be louder than a voice. And if you knew what the bugle call meant and you heard it coming across the way, it could mean retreat. It could mean attack. It could mean go to the left, wheel to the left, wheel to the right, flank left, flank right. So bugle calls and drum patterns were a really significant part of the battlefield. And this picture here, I don't know really exactly what's going on here, but to me it does look like the officers are being all hoity-toity. Never miss a chance to break out your luncheonette set and sit down for a nice meal. It looks like there's some African Americans in there, maybe serving them. So I don't exactly know the history of this picture, but it kind of makes me chuckle because the officers are being catered to overall. In the end, the Battle of Gettysburg is the turning point. Here is a movie about it, so it's a really good movie. Again, one that I wish we could stop and watch in class, but it's got a lot of our main figures represented in the movie. There's a Robert E. Lee figure. There's a Jeb Stuart character. The guy on the right, his name is Colonel, oh man, how did I just blank on that? Help me out. Josh Chamberlain, Colonel Chamberlain, major part of the story, major part of the movie. And what I want you to do on your circle is draw a big arrow because Gettysburg is the turning point of the war. You might make the connection in your brain that Saratoga was the turning point of the Revolution. Well, now we're talking about our next major war, and Gettysburg is the turning point of the Civil War. So I'll give you a chance to illustrate this arrow before we move on.
Morning,
Big easy one, just an arrow. You got the colors. Have some fun with it. Turning point of the Civil War.
We're gonna find out. Who's your kid? Who's asking? I can't just talk about myself. I'm only part of the amazing Mandela. Who's on the amazing Mandela? Oh, you're not gonna leave me alone. Are you? I see that. Oh yeah. Yours. Let's go.
It's a lot.
You guys are a lot. All right, we're pretty much there. You guys not going all in on the coloring? In the interest of time, I'm going to continue onward. Okay, if you're still sketching, that's fine. Looks like most of you are not going all in on the colors. That's fine. Yeah. Yeah. All right. How about 30-second 10 air squat break?
No.
Yeah.
Lost it. Let's do
Oh
lost it.
yeah. Get that blood flowing. Get some blood flowing. Get some blood flowing. You don't get to play soccer if you don't plug into U.S. history class.
Come on, we just had this talk. You love being in my class. Stay away from it. You told me you
There we go. Jumping jacks. I know what I need. I turned the air down. I did. I turned the air down.
You weren't here to say on so long.
All right, man. Let's say CrossFit.
All right. Back to your OG seat now. Back to the original.
You know there'll be some bright blood flow.
Tell me.
Mama say Vanya.
Not yet. Not yet. Not everybody but Terry. You know. All right, guys. I'm bringing you a really good story. It's the history of you. Please pay attention so that you don't make the same mistakes as our ancestors across time and history. I can tell who's listening, and I can tell who's going to take the class again next semester.
I don't think. Me? I gotta say word base.
Moving on.
Andrew, you better hope you don't have.
Maybe.
No. I'm talking about. I don't think I got ancestors here.
Okay, so from now Gettysburg, I said it was a big national wound, right? And with so many people involved, that means that as the years went on, there's a phrase that time heals all wounds. So think about it, 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, you got a whole generation of veterans. And even as the country has been restored, and we're going to talk about Reconstruction, even as the country has been restored, there are still people who have Southern pride and Northern pride. I want you to take a look at a couple of these pictures here and tell me what you think's going on. What do you think's going on in this picture?
The northern and the southern are talking.
Well, who's the Northerner? How can you tell?
The dude on the left.
On the left. Why?
Because he's wearing the suit.
Because he's wearing dark blue. Okay, he's wearing his old heritage uniform. And then by contrast, the other guy,
Cowboy.
cowboy hat, and what color is he in?
The dark color.
Yeah, even though it's black and white, you can tell he's in gray, Confederate gray. Well, I think this is from the 50th anniversary, if I remember the picture correctly. And these two gentlemen, I have to think about where they were on the days of the battle. They were on opposite sides of each other. They probably had their guns pointed at each other. They may have killed men on the other side, and sometimes that's a wound that's hard to live with. But here they are 50 years later, and it looks like the healing is beginning. The country is healing. Both sides are healing. Here's another picture along the same lines. I don't know the story of each of them. I don't know what they've seen or what they've done.
You can tell this.
But here they are 50 years later, shaking hands,
One of that counts.
moving on. Right now, one of them, he's wearing his medals. He is really proud of his service. He's wearing his medals. The other one, he looks, the guy on the left, the Confederate, he looks pretty grizzled, but they are healing. They're moving
It
on.
looks like he dips.
One more really powerful picture here. One of the main parts of the battle at Gettysburg was called Pickett's Charge. What happened at Pickett's Charge is many thousand Confederates, they charged over an open field. When you have an open field, no trees, no boulders, no place to hide, the bombs raining down on them, the bullets coming at them like a hornet's nest. So when they assaulted over 1 mile of open field, how many of them do you think went down?
A lot.
A lot is a good answer. Thousands. So this next picture is from a veterans reunion. Part of Pickett's Charge is it met at this place called the Angle. So what you have here are veterans meeting at the Angle 50 years after it happened. And I want you to look at what they're doing. Are you ready for it?
Good game.
They're healing. They're healing. Now, I can only imagine what each of these men did during the battle. The guys on the left had their guns pointed at the guys on the right. The guys on the right, the Confederates, they saw their friends fall. I bet they had people die to the left and to the right of them. They might have been wounded themselves. They might have barely survived. The guys on the left might have been the ones doing the shooting. They might have killed their friends.
I do not care about none of the old Confederate people. I do not care.
You're not care?
If you like slaves, you deserve to die. And you die in your old age. And you about to, by the time
What we have here is healing. Mark 1, amidst the differences in opinions, what we have here is healing, right? The country wounded itself. Slavery went away. We're going to talk about slavery going away and the victory that is. But there is still a big wound from the country. And honestly, that wound might still exist to this day in a lot of people. But this is a real moment of healing from the north to the south.
Did they still fly out of Bridgeton? Like, you know, that autograph?
Good question. There's kind of a merger of tactics. It wasn't quite the open arms march into battle. The weapons were more lethal. The weapons were more accurate. There was some guerrilla warfare. Yep, different battles were fought different ways, but it was a blend of open field and guerrilla warfare. All right, in the end, Gettysburg is a Union victory because it's the turning point of the war for the North. Let me get through this next little section, then we'll vamos al baño. From Gettysburg comes the famous Gettysburg Address. Now, it does not happen on the exact same day as the battle. It actually happens several months later. The Gettysburg Address is delivered on November 19th, 1865. I will always remember that because November 19th is Mason's birthday, my daughter's birthday. So it's delivered in November. It was dedicating the National Battlefield Cemetery at Gettysburg. Like I said, a lot of times they didn't have the chance to take bodies home. They didn't have the chance to get it to their families and give them a burial where they grew up. So a lot of times when thousands of soldiers died, they buried them right on the battlefield, right where they fell. Gettysburg being a very bloody battle, it was not the bloodiest one day of the war, but it was the bloodiest battle of the war. A 3-day battle, Gettysburg with 10,000 people dead. It was the bloodiest battle of the war. And Lincoln is dedicating this national cemetery at Gettysburg. He uses this dedication ceremony as a chance to give a speech that's about unity. Funny little side story here is that he wasn't the only speaker of the day. In fact, the guy that spoke before him spoke for 2 hours, and nobody remembers his name and nobody remembers what he said, which should probably be a point that I take to heart every single day. My point here is the guy that spoke for 2 hours, nobody remembers what he said. The Gettysburg Address is less than 150 words, and it's one of the most famous speeches of all time. So maybe the takeaway here should be brief, be bright, and get off the stage so that people will know what you say, right?
Hours though?
Yeah,
Yeah, how
yeah,
do you extend the speech?
right? Lincoln, well, I mean, I do it every day. Lincoln, he actually wrote the speech on basically like a piece of scratch paper on his way to the ceremony. He didn't have some lengthy speech writing process. He didn't have a speech writer. He didn't like think about it for days and days and days. He just wrote the speech on the back of a napkin on his way to the ceremony. And what he gives is one of the most powerful speeches in the history of the United States. His major theme is about preserving the country. And he calls us, he says we're not a collection of states, we are one nation of many people. So instead of being from Virginia, or Twerp is from North Carolina, or South Carolina, or Georgia, or New York, or New Jersey, or Pennsylvania, instead of being from a state, we are from a nation. And he also talks about the importance of all men being created equal, right? That's something our country was founded on, but it's not something we've done very good at, to be honest. Wouldn't you agree, Marquand? All men being created equal and treated equal? We haven't done a very good job of that up to this point. Here is an amazing photograph, and you can see that even with just a little movement, it made it blurry. That's why we don't have a lot of action photographs at this point. But that is Lincoln right there. He's in the middle of the crowd. He's not on a podium. He doesn't have a microphone. There's no TV cameras in his face. He's basically just standing there. And just like I speech at you guys every day, he has to project his voice a little bit. Well, I bet you'll recognize some of the phrases in this speech. He says, 7 years ago. You remember that?
Yep.
Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He wanted to remind us of what we were meant to do. Why did we become a country in the first place? A statement from the address, it says, this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Have you heard that phrase before?
No.
This government, and he's talking about our unity, this government of one union shall not perish from this earth. So a lot of classes memorize the Gettysburg Address. A lot of classes spend a whole lot of time on the Gettysburg Address. We don't have time for that. We just got to move on. But the Gettysburg Battle leads to the Gettysburg Address. This is the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and it has the Gettysburg Address etched in stone behind it. So hopefully this will never be destroyed. Hopefully it'll never go away. And that means that the Gettysburg Address will always be right there.
What if they come and destroy it?
And that is our pause point. So let's go to the bathroom. Vamos se baño. I'm not even sure that's proper Spanish, but sure.
No, that's why you say fast.
No como estas.
My legs.
He's pulling Spanish.
I don't know if you watched Night at the Museum, but
I have seen that museum.
I love that. I think it's the first one or second one, but
Yeah.
where the night guard like goes up, testing all the
Who's that?
That was you. Oh, that was not hard. I'm gonna use D1. You take green. All right, I got my eyes on you. You see the energy, man. You don't have to shut up. I'm D1, Robert. Yeah, he's gone, bro. Why was that across for? I thought that was on the head now, bro. You know what I do? Mid-air. Oh, bro. You in the air? No, mid-air.
Mid-air.
I'm glad things air, boy. Hey,
All right, Swanson,
let's
it's cold
round it
and
out. 4 o'clock Thursday. 4 o'clock Wednesday. I get it, but it's basically like Thursday.
Monday?
Tomorrow
What
Friday.
day are we on?
Yeah, well, it's a short week. It's
Oh,
already
no.
Wait, what's today?
It's
Wednesday.
It's Wednesday.
But tomorrow's basically like Friday.
Oh, I
last
thought
day
it
of
was.
the week.
I thought it was Tuesday.
Not bad.
All right, we got it. Check it out. The next battle we're going to talk about is called the Battle of Vicksburg. And I'll tell you, I bet you haven't been taught very well about the Battle of Vicksburg. It is an addition to Georgia Standards, which means we must talk about it because it's likely to be captured on the EOC. It's a very important battle, and this is why we're going to talk about it. So, remember, let me take you back to the Anaconda Plan. You're going to see the Anaconda Plan come alive at the Battle of Vicksburg. Vicksburg is actually a siege, okay? So some battles are 1 day, some battles are 3 days. Vicksburg lasted from May to June to July. So it's a long siege. That means they surrounded the city and kind of cut them off. This is under Vicksburg. Under the Gettysburg Address, we're on Vicksburg. Vicksburg, Mississippi is actually a city that's the high ground. From a military perspective, you always want the high ground. You want to shoot down at someone, not have to shoot up at them, right? So Vicksburg being on a high ground, that's pretty advantageous from a military perspective. It is also on the bend in the river. It's on the Mississippi River. It's on the bend in the river. And that means that ships going through this area, they'd have to slow down to navigate the bend. They would it's kind of like a choke point. So it's not like you could sneak on through it. You couldn't just put your fast little cruiser and blast on through the area. You had to slow down deliberately. So the bend is kind of significant to the geography as well. Short of it is, whoever controlled Vicksburg controlled the Mississippi River. Whoever controlled the Mississippi River controlled the whole western half of the United States, could cut the Confederacy in half. Part of the Anaconda Plan was to control the Mississippi River, be able to transport troops and supplies up and down the Mississippi River. So all that to say is that Vicksburg, Mississippi is very key to the Anaconda Plan. It's originally a Confederate city. Mississippi is deep south, so it is controlled by the Confederates. They have their guns in place. They have their cannons in place. General Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, his armies come in and surround the city, and basically they try to squeeze the life out of them, just like the Anaconda Plan. They want to choke them out. They want to make them use their food and water and ammunition until they have no more. That's what a siege is. So they surrounded the city, and they wanted to choke them out. That's how they would win at the Battle of Vicksburg. That was the plan. Here's a map here. It kind of shows that deep bend in the river. You can also see from the top there, that is just a regular city full of women and children and churches and hospitals. It's not a military town. It's not a base. Like we have Fort Benning in Georgia, Fort Stewart. That's a military base. This is not a base. It's a town. So there's women and children in it. There's churches, there's hospitals, there's farms. But it doesn't matter because it was significant to controlling the Mississippi River. That's why Grant made it a siege. That's why they were going to siege around the city. So you can also see the deep bend in the river there. Another angle here kind of shows that really deep bend. That's why Vicksburg was significant, because it was the key to controlling the Mississippi River. Here is Ulysses S. Grant. His initials are US, and that might be, this may or may not be on your notes.
No, it's not.
Ulysses S. Grant, his initials are US, and people say that his nickname is Unconditional Surrender. He didn't give you any surrender, right? He was going to defeat you completely. He's a tough guy. Looking from that picture there, he's a brawler. You know what he died from? Just a little extra. You know what he died from?
He got sick.
Throat cancer. You know why?
Tobacco.
Tobacco is right. Yeah, did you know that? Very impressed. Very impressed. Yeah, so he's a brawler, man. Like he's a dipper, he's a spitter, he's a cusser.
Whoa,
Right. This is U.S. Grant. This is U.S. Grant. Well, the city falls to Grant on, look at this, July 4th, 1863. July 4th, Independence Day. Also, take yourself back to your Gettysburg notes. What were the days of the Battle of Gettysburg?
July 4th.
July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, followed by Vicksburg on July 4th. So you got two big victories in 2 days. July 3rd, the Union wins at Gettysburg. July 4th, the Union wins at Vicksburg. Well, what's that? And that's the day that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died. Very good, very good. So in taking Vicksburg, the Confederacy is cut in half. Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, they are cut off from the rest of the South. I'm going to show you a map here in a second as well. So Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, they are now on their own. Look at this map right here. So I like this map because of the colors. You see the United States, you see the Confederate States, and that line right there, that's the Mississippi River line. So Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, they are cut off to the west. They can no longer support the rest of the Confederacy. They can't send troops, they can't send supplies. They are cut off at the Mississippi River. So part of the Anaconda Plan was to do exactly this. To do exactly this is working. Anaconda Plan is working. Another map here, for those of you who like to see pictures, this map here shows every single battle of the Civil War, 384 battles. So first, I always like to look far to the west. Like there's one random battle in Idaho. There's a battle in Colorado. There's a couple of battles. Colorado.
No.
There's a couple of battles in North Dakota. But those are the onesies, twosies. Come over to the east. Where are most of the battles being fought?
East side Jordan.
East side of the west side of Georgia. Actually, the west side of Georgia. And what's this concentrated area right here? Virginia. Virginia, yeah. But the reason I show you this picture, this is the Mississippi River, this is Vicksburg. So when they controlled Vicksburg right here, they cut the whole country in half by owning the Mississippi River. This is why Vicksburg is a very significant battle. So in your circle, draw the river and a snake because it was part of the Anaconda Plan.
How are you supposed to draw a river and a snake?
Like this. Let me just draw two things. Draw two things. Yeah. I know we've already illustrated the Anaconda Plan, but I want you to remember that Vicksburg was on the Mississippi River and it accomplished a major part of the Anaconda Plan. Vicksburg, Mississippi, Mississippi River, Anaconda Plan. So I'll give you a second to do that. Yeah, I had fun looking for snake jiffies on jiff.com. There's a lot of them. Some artist does a song on Anaconda. Nicki Minaj. And Taylor Swift had a bunch of Reputation.
I've never heard so much Taylor Swift in a week.
I swear.
Hey, me and my friends, we spread them.
Every other day. It takes me back to nostalgia. Vicksburg, Mississippi, the river and the Anaconda Plan. We have about 30 more seconds. If you're still illustrating, that's fine, but I'm going to move on in just a second.
You know, Mr. Slice was in today.
What?
He was like, you know how he was actually telling us stuff about like stuff about like this time period. And there's stuff about me guys and that stuff. He was talking us about the battle song, but he was explaining that. I told him I was gonna tell him.
All right, so as you finish illustrating, I'm going to move on. What we have here, we said Gettysburg was the turning point. These two battles together, major turning point. 2 victories within 48 hours. The end is near for the South, and the end is near for the North in a good way, right? They're going to win. We see light at the end of the tunnel. So both of these victories were major turning points. And overall victory was inevitable at this point. Now, the war does go on for a little bit longer, but victory was inevitable at this point. Next battle we're going to talk about, something you probably already learned about because you're sitting in the state of Georgia, and that is the Battle of Atlanta. Now, I told you that the North had 90% of industry and manufacturing in the country. But I told you that in the South, Atlanta was the hub for Southern industry and manufacturing. So a hub, like a center point, right? Factories and railroads. A lot of railroads converged in Atlanta. So Atlanta was kind of different than the agrarian South, the farming South. Atlanta was a manufacturing hub. And that makes it a valuable military target to the Union. The man you see on your screen there, this is William Tecumseh Sherman. I like that he's doing the Napoleon thing. He looks pretty rough and tumble. Probably wouldn't want to get into a bar fight with him. I think he'd probably win. He and his forces, his army, siege Atlanta for 6 weeks. So the same thing, when I say the word siege, that means they surrounded Atlanta for 6 weeks. They bombed the inside of the city. They waited for Atlanta to be out of food, out of water, out of ammunition. And 6 weeks later, the city falls to Sherman. Right?
Looks like he cheats on his wife.
Bro, it look like he wrote his.
Looks like he drinks a lot of beer.
Yo,
but I think-
kids.
So what's
Napoleon did it first.
It looks like he cheats on his wife.
It's very
Yeah, but
European.
it shows
Yeah,
something.
Napoleon did
It's
it like
like-
it's an officer thing.
Yeah,
No, it was like a yeehaw. That's what it is.
Napoleon was like, it's gonna be him.
Like these days,
Napoleon was like,
I never post for
I
picture
do
like
like
this. Unless it's
this.
it's very European. So you see here, Atlanta is a significant hub of Confederate industry, manufacturing, and railroads. And the reason that Sherman wanted to attack Atlanta was to disrupt Confederate supply lines. If you tear up the railroad tracks, they can't send supplies to where their troops are. If you tear up their factories, they can't make uniforms or guns or wagons or all the other things that they need.
What was Plains during all this?
Where was what? Not existent, not yet. 1908, right,
That's
brothers?
right.
Keokuk, North
Yeah,
Carolina.
which is the.
This picture here, this is actually General Sherman overlooking the city of Atlanta. I think that's pretty cool picture we got there because he's actually surveying Atlanta. Which, how many of you have never been to Atlanta? Right, the opposite. How many of you have been to Atlanta? Like most of us has passed through Atlanta, right? Or even if you've been on the highway around Atlanta because you don't want to cut through it. Like we're in Georgia. This is a part of our history.
Don't go in the lower part of the, go to the high part of the.
So Atlanta falls on September 2nd, 1865. And guess what? Hey, part one, major part of our history. General Sherman burns Atlanta to the ground. He burns Atlanta to the ground. If you go to Atlanta today, you will not see any buildings that are older than 1865. They burned them all to the ground. If you go to Atlanta, you do not see much history or much heritage that comes from before 1865. It all got burned to the ground. Now, the next thing that happens, a lot of times these things are connected, but really it's like one thing leads to the other. The Battle of Atlanta leads to Sherman's march to the sea. And what that means is that Sherman goes from Atlanta and he travels southeast to Savannah and he burns everything in his way between it. Railroads, roads, buildings, crops, livestock. It's called total war. He is destroying the Southern economy. He's destroying the Southerners' will to resist. He burns 285 miles from Atlanta to Savannah, about 50 miles wide, because that's how far his army stretched out. He cuts a hole, or he cuts a line straight through Georgia. And in those towns, I'm going to show you a map here in just a second. In those towns, same thing. You don't see a lot of buildings that are older than 1865. You don't see a lot of history that's older than 1865. Because General William Tecumseh Sherman burned it to the ground between November and December of 1865. So I got a step ahead of myself. What I want you to do on the Battle of Atlanta is draw a peach with barbed wire around it. That means they sieged Atlanta, right? A peach with barbed wire around it. They sieged the city of Atlanta, and that's how I want you to remember that. Sherman sieged Atlanta.
So that I can see where it says Sherman's gold.
Sherman's
Make it dark.
resupply lines.
And you can't even talk about that, you know. You can't talk about this.
You take it dirty.
So we're finishing up Battle of Atlanta, and I'm going to move on to the March to the Sea. Try to do it before my kid busts into the room because she's coming today.
Yay!
Make sure you.
That's detailed, so we can.
I'll keep the sword right here.
What you doing?
All right, about 10 seconds. I'm going to move on. Interest of time. So moving on to the March to the Sea. He starts his march in November, and he marches from Atlanta to Savannah between November and December of 1864. Devastates the Southern infrastructure, the Southern economy, all the way from Atlanta to Savannah. I'm going to show you a map here in just a second so you can kind of visualize it in your state. Funny little story here, December of 1864. he actually gets to Savannah right before Christmas. And what he does is he sends a letter to Abraham Lincoln. Says, "Dear Mr. President, I got you a Christmas present. It's the city of Savannah." He basically gifted the city of Savannah to Lincoln for Christmas. And this was significant because it was a kind of towards the end of the war, it crippled the Southern economy. It was kind of one of the last things that was necessary to get the South to ultimately surrender and, of course, end the war. So I'm sure Lincoln appreciated that particular Christmas gift on that day. Picture here, it is in the 3D. It's soldiers tearing up railroad ties. So to think about it, how do you damage a railroad? You just got to take up a couple feet worth of railroad ties. You don't have to rip up the whole thing. If you ripped up 10 feet of railroad ties, that's enough to derail the train. So they would do this every several miles. They'd rip up 10 or 20 feet of railroad ties, and that would be enough to destroy that mile worth of railway. And that's how the railroads got destroyed.
You could just get a tree branch and place it 75 degrees up, and I would come, trying to heal people. You gotta get a lot of tree branches.
Okay. One other thing, on Sherman's March to the Sea, I'll show you the map here. So you can see it starts in Atlanta, and it's spread out. He had multiple units. It wasn't just like they got in a single file line and walked to Savannah. They spread out over about 50 miles. You can see the different routes that they took. A couple of big cities in there: McDonough, Covington, Madison, Milledgeville, Louisville. Gets all the way to Savannah. Where is Alma? Where is Alma?
At the Star.
At the Stars, right? So Alma is at the Yellow Star. Okay, we are a couple hundred miles away from the route itself, but it's still a part of our heritage. You can see the route is 285 miles long from Atlanta to Savannah. So that's a big stretch of destruction. And it was about 50 miles wide overall. Alma is the Yellow Star, and we're right above where the railroads intersect. What town is that? Waycross, because it's where the ways cross.
Wow.
That's why Waycross got his name. It's where the ways cross. Yeah, that's right. So, dad joke turned into a town name. So one more little side story for you about Savannah. Did you see this path of death and destruction? They were burning roads, railroads, crops, livestock. They were making total war. But when they got to the edge of Savannah, anybody ever been to Savannah?
Yes.
I lived pretty close to Savannah when I was at Fort Stewart. When they got to the edge of Savannah, the people, the leaders of Savannah, okay, the leaders of Savannah, they met Sherman on the edge of the city. And they said, "General Sherman, sir, we have heard that you are coming. We know that you've been destroying everything in your path. Sir, if you please, we will give you the city if you do not harm or burn it down. We know that you win. We know that you're going to come on in. Please do not burn our city to the ground." And you know what?
He burned it down.
He didn't.
I would burn it.
It was his outstretching of civility. He was saying, "Okay, we are all going to have to heal from this in the end. So I'm going to not burn down Savannah." So he made it to the sea, right? I mean, he made his whole march to the sea. But if you go to Savannah today, you will see buildings that are older than 1865. You will see history in Savannah that is older than 1865 because Sherman did not burn it to the ground. I think that's a pretty cool story about the history of Savannah. A little bit more about Sherman's March. Well, I got a couple pictures. So here they are with the railroad ties. I think this one pops pretty well. This one here, Third Block was really amused by this picture. It just kind of shows the route that he would have taken, part of the route that he would have taken in his present day. Yeah, is this one like really 3D? I think the trees are really coming out at us.
I couldn't see the rest of them. Let me see real quick.
Yeah, you got to put the blue on your right eye. Blue on your right eye.
That's fine.
Yeah, I see it.
All right, let's end this war. We got one more of my favorite 3D pictures to come at the end. I'll turn the lights off for that one, and I think you'll be amused by it. Ending the war, the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse, April of 1865. General Robert E. Lee surrenders his army, the Army of Northern Virginia, to General Ulysses S. Grant. What happens is that in Appomattox, Virginia, General Lee has an army of 28,000 men. General Grant surrounds his army with 125,000 men. So the Northern Army has 5 times as many soldiers surrounding Lee's army. Lee's army is, they're devastated, they're hungry, they're tired. Many of them are deserting on a daily basis. They're just running away from camp. They're deserting the army. So on April 8th, the Confederates, they're surrounded, no possibility of escape. April 9th, Robert E. Lee.
Mr. Swanson?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Swanson?
Yes, ma'am.
Read for checkout, please.
I didn't hear you. Andy? Andy?
No.
Anybody
So what you need?
Anybody expect to be? Can you text it for me?
I'll text it.
All right, check it out. April 9th, Robert E. Lee. I love being in the middle of like an emphatic speech and then getting interrupted by the intercom. I'll probably put that on my Instagram tonight. On April 9th, Robert E. Lee sends a message across enemy lines to General Grant. He says, "We need to meet. I'm ready to surrender." So on April 9th at 1 p.m., I think it's funny that they gave the exact time, right? They set an exact time to meet. They meet in the home, a nearby home of a farmer, and Robert E. Lee surrenders his entire army, 28,000 soldiers. He surrenders them to General Grant. This effectively ends the Civil War. Now, there were other commanders still out fighting, but once word got spread that General Lee had surrendered his army, all the other Confederate generals, they started to surrender as well. Keaton, you are dismissed. General Grant writes out terms of surrender, and they were actually very lenient. That's important to know. He could have taken them prisoner. He could have charged them with treason. He could have made them into the bad guys. But here's what he said. He said, "All right, Confederates, lay down your arms and go back home. Go back to your farms. Go back to your life. The war is over. You are returning to, you are our countrymen again." General Grant has this quote. He actually says, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." Now, the officers, they even got to keep their sidearm, their swords or their pistols. They got to keep their sidearms, and they got to keep their horses. So it's a very, very lenient terms of surrender, and it set the stage for the nation to heal. We'll call that Reconstruction. We're going to go over Reconstruction come next week. Sets the stage for the nation to heal.
Wait, so all his soldiers was just like, okay, we go.
Well, that's part of leadership, is that the leader sets the terms of surrender, and when he surrenders, that's what they do. So here are some Southerners in their surrender before they laid their arms down, I guess. Here are stacks and stacks of weapons. This is how they turned their weapons in. Just laid them down, right? They disarmed the whole army so that they couldn't keep fighting. But other than that, they let them go home. And this is a picture, a bit of a portrait. I wish there was photography of this moment, but there's not, unfortunately. But this shows General Lee surrendering to General Grant. Here are these two men in real life. Okay, so General Lee, a little bit older, more distinguished. General Grant, a little bit younger, known for being aggressive. Again, just a couple more pictures of these gentlemen right here. General Lee, very distinguished. We're going to talk about their personalities a little bit more tomorrow, just kind of rounding it out here right now. Now check this out. This is the room. This is a portrait of the room where it happened. And you can even see they don't even really have good furniture. Lee has a high back chair. Grant has a chair that's kind of got some padding in it. Actually, check this out. This is the actual furniture that they sat in on that day. Lee sat in that high back chair. What did you say? It's like what? Grant sat in the chair that has a little bit of padding, and that tiny little table is where the Civil War ended. That tiny little writing table is where the surrender was signed, right there. So check this out. This is another kind of rendering of the room, and actually at Appomattox Courthouse today, I've never been there, but you could visit it like a museum. They have this room set up kind of like it was on that day. How'd they do? Lee's got the high-backed chair. There it is. Lee has that white table. There it is.
A chair right there.
Grant has the black chair. It's a little bit shorter.
That's cool.
There it is with the tiny writing table. even that chest that's kind of to the back of the room and the fireplace, they've got the whole room set up just like it was. What's that? Even the floor tiles. Yeah. Yeah. So
You go back. And the things that are on the fireplace too.
everything. You're right. All the details have been taken care of. So,
Everything.
I don't know. I think it's fascinating that somebody decided to save that furniture. But it's kind of a piece of history that we still have today. So overall, Appomattox Courthouse, really easy. The South surrenders, which makes it a Northern victory. And what I want you to put in your circle is the surrender flag. Just like in the Revolutionary War, we had that final battle called Yorktown, where the British surrendered. We now have the final battle of the Civil War called Appomattox, where the Confederates surrender. Like I said, it didn't last, there were some commanders still out there who hadn't surrendered. The war is technically still on for about another month, but all things considered, the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse was the end of the Civil War. Question? What happened to Sherman? He stays alive for a while, and
Then he dies.
I don't know exactly. You know what? I'll answer that question tomorrow. I'm gonna tell you about Sherman tomorrow. Good question. So check this out. April 9th, 1865, the war is over. Abraham Lincoln decides to go to the theater to celebrate on April 14th, 1865, 5 days later. Abraham Lincoln is only alive to celebrate the victory of the Union being preserved for 5 days. Abraham Lincoln only stays alive for 5 more days before he is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. I'm going to tell you all about the assassination story next week. I'm going to give it a whole day because it's so interesting. But my point here is Lee surrenders, and then Lincoln is assassinated a whole 5 days later. So he never really gets to enjoy the victory because he dies at the end of the Hang on. So hey, classes, one more time. This is probably what is your favorite picture of all the 3D pictures? Because is anyone about to get poked by that cigar? That cigar is like coming right off the screen at you. Put them on. And you know what? The farther back I get, that cigar just keeps coming off the screen. It's great. You gotta check it out. So the war officially ends on May 10th, 1865. Let me round this out. Come on, stick with me. Here we go. We're doing good. The effects of the war. 1, America is reunited. Kind of, right? I mean, there's still issues, but at least the Union has been preserved. The southern states return to the Union. America is reunited. The era of Reconstruction begins in the South. Reconstruction is how we went about healing, how we went about rebuilding the South, politically, economically. Reconstruction. It's going to be a whole unit, or it's going to be a whole nother topic we'll get to tomorrow or this next week. It's Selah. And finally, much of the South is left in economic devastation following the war. In the end, what hurt the most was the money. It's all about that money. It always is. I got one more screen. Don't check out on me just yet. Don't break my stick either, little girl. All right, this last screen. This is a fact that I read. This is a fact that I read several months ago. Go sit with Ansley. This is a fact I read several months ago. And this fact is so mind-blowing to me that I knew I had to include it in my class. So hear me out on this class. I've waited like 5 months to deliver this fact to you. First statement. Altogether, the cost of the war was $6.7 billion. Okay, the cost of the war was $6.7 billion. A lot of money. Listen to this next half. In $1860, if the federal government could have purchased every single slave in the South and given them 40 acres of land per family, and it would have cost $3.1 billion. If they really wanted to end slavery, they could have just bought it. But we go on to fight a war that cost $6.7 billion, basically double the cost of potentially purchasing every slave. So the question has to be, why did we fight the war? Was it worth it? Could we have ended our conflict in a different way? Because what this doesn't even talk about, or what this doesn't even cover, is the 500,000 people who died. So chew on that fact, and we will pick it up again tomorrow, like always. Darn announcements every time.